stranger saying I was in tears, but it really calmed me down and made me feel wonderful, and I'm just so proud of him. He arranged the music, I only wrote the words, I should say.
Well, it's a lovely thing to have as a memorial to him. Just a last serious word, if you would. You did take seriously the need to cancel that funeral.
The government is launching an app to monitor cases here and include them in its national totals. France's most senior health official has said that numbers could spiral as a result. At the beginning of March, President Macron visited a care home to talk about protection. He was filmed sitting at a table surrounded by elderly residents. No face masks then, no social distancing. A few days later, all visits to France's retirement homes were banned, and last week the government said all residents should be individually isolated in their rooms. But care workers say that they are now the biggest risk to residents. We talked to one nurse who wanted to be known just as Carol. She said that some homes were keeping masks in reserve for a coronavirus outbreak and not giving them to staff. And with many workers off sick or in isolation themselves, she says, the spread of this virus is very hard to control.
The collective effort is first and foremost that of those on the front line, the caregivers, and all those who contribute to the French healthcare system.
Paris, the time is exactly 10 to 9. It was reported in the Mail on Sunday over the weekend that senior Downing Street sources believe there will have to be a reckoning, as they put it, with China over what they suggest is a list of deficiencies and obfuscations that has led to this worldwide pandemic. We know, of course, that the initial reports of the virus resulted in police action rather than health action, but since then China has claimed that it is being much more open, and the World Health Organization thinks it has too. We can tell there will have to be a change in the way China behaves, and that the outside world can reasonably expect to have assurances about how that change will pan out in the future.
I think coronavirus 2019 will change many ways, and will change the images and the assessment of the behavior of almost all the governments, of all the countries in the world. In this context, what China has been doing is truly remarkable, and it is widely acclaimed by the WHO and by many, many countries in the world. Don't forget, at the end of 2019, China already officially filed with the WHO about what they found about this virus. And since the beginning of January, China has kept WHO, as well as, for example, US government, constantly informed about the major developments of this whole thing. And if anyone missed any of this fighting with the WHO, and member states have the full advantage of the benefits of the filing, then at least every country in the world would get the major signal when China locked down the Wuhan city.
But nonetheless, by bureaucrats locally, was to clamp down on information and bully the doctors who warned about it. And I suppose what my question is, can the outside world expect that when this is over or controlled, that China says we will not do that sort of thing again?
So first of all, China is a big country. China's population is more than all the OECD countries combined. Every day there are lots of mistakes happening in China involving all kinds of mistakes. And as I mentioned before, in the weeks running all the way up to January the 21st, of course there were many ways, many things which can be improved. But China did fight it with the WHO, China did keep major countries informed. And China did take draconian measures to lock down the Wuhan city and the Hubei province.
Can I ask you this, Mr.
Anyone in Britain?
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. Can I ask you this? We're slightly short of time, so sorry to interrupt. But when the Downing Street uses that phrase, a reckoning, I just wonder whether there isn't a sense in which the reckoning is not for China, but is actually for the West.
Some people used to call this the big society, Nick, before you got into number 10. Danny, Your book, Slow Down, is suffused with a huge amount of data about how previous pandemics, such as the Spanish global flu pandemic between 1918 and 19, affected things like industrial production. Could you just give us a sense of historical perspective? I know it's early on in this crisis, we don't know how it's going to pan out, but how, in terms of your knowledge of the global flu pandemic from a century ago, how might this compare so far?
So we say that's the reason. We don't step back and actually say our rate of production in general, worldwide, per person, was not as productive as it was for their parents or their grandparents' generation. We tend to have an assumption that everything is speeding up when it doesn't speed up. We look for individual events, massive events, and we blame it all on them, rather than say, actually, the greatest era of innovation was the 1930s. We are inventing fewer things. It's not all bad, but we're going to have to get ready to live in a world in which we do not constantly become ever more rich and our pet.
It's so fascinating you guys say that, because the sense I get listening to you both now, and very much the sense that I got reading your books, was that we are going through one of history's sort of hinge moments. We're entering a new epoch or new era, if you like, where a lot of the assumptions that have governed previous eras are up for grabs. Let's talk a bit about your books, and start with you, Nick. It's almost two books. There was an introduction which was part mea culpa, part memoir. You settle some scores in there, and then you get into some of the conservatism later. Let's do it in that order. You've written a very candid introduction. You talk about the effects that 2017 had on your mental health. What would you say, what's the most candid you could be now about the biggest mistakes that you feel and you're willing to admit you made in 2017?
Where the campaign in 2017 was misconceived for a couple of reasons. I mean, firstly, we built up quite a lot of political capital in the year in Downing Street by making ourselves the proponents of change, by making the case that we as Conservatives were much more interested in the community and not just individualism, and much more interested in the nation and not just markets, and that we would use the power of the state to improve people's lives. We talked about the experience of working class people, which was quite unusual for language for a Conservative government. And we had all this kind of political capital behind us. And then we went into the election, and instead of continuing that kind of logic and talking about how we were change makers, if you like, we returned to a kind of reassurance and continuity message, which I think was a mistake. And of course, the manifesto went wrong with the social care policy, and the manifesto was my responsibility in the campaign. If we're talking about biggest mistakes, that was it.
And when you talk about Theresa May, I was very taken in your introduction that you are frank about the fact that I think you described her campaign at one point as wooden.
I think to a degree we knew the limitations of her communications abilities, but we'd kind of managed to rise above that previously by playing to her virtues, which was her kind of moral seriousness, sense of public service, and so on. I think this is one of the ways in which we made mistakes in the campaign. So I think originally the Downing Street team envisaged a campaign which would be quite traditional and make a virtue of things being kind of unspun and having sort of daily press conferences with different members of the cabinet taking part and so on. But as pretty much as soon as the campaign was called, the advice based on polling was that actually the Tory party brand was still very poor. The polling about individual members of the cabinet was very poor. The big advantage the party had was Theresa, and so the decision was taken to make it very much a kind of personal, almost presidential campaign, which none of us had anticipated going into the campaign, and obviously with hindsight was a big mistake.
Danny, have you got, in retrospect now, some years on, have you got a sense of where the 2017 election went? I mean, it's worth saying that the Tories did still emerge as the biggest party.
Well, I mean, it's also worth saying, I mean, it was absolutely correct politically for her to call that election, because they were so far ahead of the polls that no party post-war had ever seen a fall of the kind that she saw. So the decision to call 2017 election was correct. In a way,
ideas that are behind the policies that have got us here. And in particular, I'm interested in the flaws in philosophical liberalism and the ways in which liberalism has mutated into what I call kind of ultra-extreme forms across the left, right and centre. And while I think it is actually possible for the Labour Party to give the country the kind of communitarian correction I think we need. The book is really an attempt to explain how conservatism, real conservatism, not the kind of economic liberalism that people associate with it, can overcome ideology, and by doing that we can remake the country, so borrowing the language of past conservatives like Disraeli and Baldwin, we can be one nation again. It's a plea for conservatism to sort of return to its philosophical roots and to try to put aside divisiveness and try to unify.
And before we get into what that conservatism is, because in a sense there's nothing new about it, you're going back, as you say, to the roots conservatism. Let's just get politics itself.
Well, I mean, freedom is clearly a really important human value, but actually liberty, freedom is not the only value that matters to human beings. We're also interested in other values like concern about inequality or solidarity or health or the dignity of being respected by your fellow human beings. So when we place freedom as the overriding value, then I think we get humanity wrong, and that's what quite often leads to policy failures.
Danny, can I ask?
In terms of thinking, and in Europe it captured it more in the UK than anywhere else. So that our Conservative Party moved further and further and further, if you like, to the right. If you compare our Conservative Party to the Conservatives in Germany, they have a very different idea of freedom and responsibilities. They spend about €1 billion more a week on their health service. That's why they have 5 times as many ventilators and so on. The traditional conservatism has been kept alive and kicking in much of Europe, and it also sees freedom differently. Freedom isn't just freedom to do what you want to do any old time and become as rich as you would like. Freedom is also freedom from fear. It's the freedom from being afraid that you or your children or your grandchildren will end up on the streets. It's freedom from the idea that you'll have to spend your whole life working in a dead-end job simply to pay the rent so somebody else can have a very nice life. Freedom, the idea of freedom,
of market fundamentalism, which is often associated with people like Margaret Thatcher, isn't actually that new, is it? I mean, there was a very strong conservative critique of Thatcherism in the immediate aftermath of Thatcherism. So John Gray wrote an essay, which I remember well, called The Undoing of Conservatism in 1991. David Willett wrote pamphlets on civic conservatism in 1994. Here we are 25 or 30 years on, and you're making a similar case to what they were making. Why is this time different, and why did the Conservative Party not listen to those critiques of market fundamentalism a couple of decades ago?
Of business, and it's absolutely fundamental, I think, that if you want to maintain, to repair the social fabric of the country, if you want capitalism to work, as I do, then when we come out of this second bailout, then we're going to need a fundamentally different relationship between business and society.
We should have learned, and we forget how quickly we can forget things.
That plays into, forgive me for interrupting, that plays into your thesis on slowdown. But just before we get into that cognitive dissonance which you talk about and the economics, can I just close off a couple of points about society? Yes. I mean, Nick mentioned the word belonging when he talked about the balance between freedom and belonging. I've lost count of the number of, frankly, mediocre columns I've read in recent years saying issues of identity and belonging have replaced class as the key fault line in politics. Why is that? Why is identity, why is belonging supplanted class if it has as the key driver of politics? Danny, and then
Class D or C2, whereas many younger people with very precarious, very low-paid jobs, they often count as Class B. So we've got our way in which we describe classes have been got wrong. But for the sort of chattering classes, for the media, identity politics is fun. It's just for most people, they do not find it that interesting that most people are trying to struggle to get through life, and they're wondering if they're old. Why on earth could they get a home in their 20s? Why could they start a family in their 20s? Why did they have a job which they didn't worry about losing because they had full employment, and their grandchildren have none of that? I think that is a key political issue, is insecurity for the young and the old looking at the young and saying, what on earth went wrong?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, my view is that class is actually just as relevant as ever. The nature of class is probably changing, so sort of older working class people will tend to maybe have more assets than younger working class people because they're more likely to have been homeowners, they're more likely to be white, they're more likely to be sort of socially connected to people around, culturally diverse, or urban, really quite insecure economically with no kind of assets saved up, and to quite often undermine the interests of working class people.
So why is it happening? Forgive me, why is it happening? Because this is the thing that I don't hear enough of, is why, if it is the case that identity, woke values, as people often talk about, has become increased in its appeal to some people, as Danny says, on the sort of media left, if you like, they talk about, why has that happened? Why have some factions of perhaps the Metropolitan or the media
go and then a sort of leap over to the Atlantic, and the kind of American gender and race theorists, including those who promoted intersectionality as a theory, but from those bodies of thought, I think has emerged national stories hurt people. There's now this sense that that words themselves are violent.
Okay, a slightly provocative suggestion, but if you accept that our politics is beginning to swing back towards the left, our Conservative Party will slowly moved towards becoming a normal European Conservative Party, and our Labour Party has moved in many ways to being a normal social democratic party from European standards. One problem that Conservatives have, if we're moving in that direction, is how do you criticise the left if you're actually moving towards the left? And I think, this may be a bit disingenuous of me, but I think concentrating on the concern that the left has for minorities who are stigmatised, which the left, you know, for its history knows, it was the left who spoke up for gay people, it was the left who spoke up for people who were being stabbed in the 1970s when I was young because they were Asian.
I disagree. I mean, firstly, I wouldn't characterise what's happened to the Labour Party as a move to a conventional social democratic position anyway. Its economics have been far to the left of that, but also its attitude on these points of cultural liberalism, where the left talks in the terms that it does about identity politics, or whether it's, you know, if we take, for example, changes coming from the left.
We are probably in an era where we are going to be more careful about our words and our language, but we have to worry about everybody's attitudes and everybody's feelings. One fascinating thing of the Brexit referendum result was it meant that we had to begin to look into what was it that in particularly elderly people who voted to leave were most concerned about.
Was it pace of change? Because there is the one of the ways of understanding what happened recently.
Down, and ironically, the four things which were accelerating, which were air flights, carbon emissions, temperatures, and graduates, because of the current pandemic, are actually also slowing.
So what else is slowing down in the graphs that are showing things are slowing down?
Oh, well, most importantly, we've slowed down the number of children we are having since 1968. This is 50 years of demographic slowdown. But economically, in terms of GDP, we slowed down. More controversially, if you measure the rate of innovation and inventions, we always like to claim we're inventing amazing new things. But last year we invented a mobile phone that you could bend slightly. You know, our inventions are not as dramatic as the tractor 100 years ago, or the aeroplane. 747s were first flown in 1968.
I thought that was
in America. Still growing, but the rate of increase is slow.
But what would be forgive me for interrupting again, Danny, but what would be the thing, what is the connective tissue that makes there be a slowdown in the rate of growth in the average human height or life expectancy, and also the number of selfies that people take, or the number of rubbish that it tends to go out? What is the thing that is causing a slowdown across such a range of different parts of life?
The underlying most important thing is that we went through an acceleration in our numbers as a species that species only very, very rarely do. Ironically, it was Darwin in The Origin of Species who talked about how in 2 or 3 favourable seasons species can balloon in their number. Now this happened to human beings. We went from 1 billion to 2 to 4 to we're approaching 8. It's a one-off thing, and when that happens, it was accompanied by discovering steam power, by innovation, by electricity. When that happens, for a few generations, everything changes. For about 6 or 7, everything changes. Fundamental beliefs, religions, food, try to think of it as normal. We think of incredible change as normal. And other than leaving this planet and going to other planets, which is very, very, very hard to do, it simply has to slow down. That it already is slowed down.
And the argument of your book, towards the end of the book, Danny, is that the implication of this slowdown across so many different indicators is that the world that we're living through today is a sort of transitionary moment, and you're particularly critical of the idea that the form of capitalism which we have at the moment is going to be one which we have for a long time. Why do you say that the capitalism we have today is merely a transitionary phase?
Because it required constant growth to work, and with constant growth it could appear to work. So while world population was increasing rapidly, markets every year were getting bigger. If you're Coca-Cola and you simply sold to the same proportion of people as you sold last year, you would become more profitable.
Is going to change the pursuit of growth, and that we'd also argue that we need to reinvent capitalism to make sure it's, as you put it, inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed Danny's book, and I found a lot of it persuasive. I mean, I think that where I probably am a little sceptical is I thought it had a feel of a kind of end of history from a sort of leftish green perspective, if that's okay, Danny. And I sort of wondered about some of the consequences of some of the ways in which we're undoubtedly slowing down. So if we imagine a world with far slower or even no economic growth, then I sort of worry that actually leads to division in some forms of political extremism. Because in a world without growth, you're arguing over who gets what share of the non-growing cake, and historically the right in those circumstances can pick on minorities, the left can pursue aggressive class wars. I think there are also consequences of an aging society, because obviously that fundamentally changes the shape of the economy, the shape of public services in the state, and the ways in which we raise revenues to fund those things. So sort of
out now.
Changes.
And Danny Dorling's Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration is published next month. Next week, Kirsty Walk looks at what role having 2 X chromosomes is playing in surviving the coronavirus. But for now, goodbye and keep safe.
Start the Week was presented by Amol Rajan and produced by Katie Hickman. If you'd like to download and listen to previous Start the Weeks going back to 2008, they're all on the episodes page of the Start the Week website on BBC Radio 4 and BBC Sounds. Now on Longwave and DAB Digital Radio, it's time for the Daily Service, led by the Reverend Peter J. Quiss.
Very sadly in a care home, but just regarding going funerals, we've been informed that there'll be, and we're Catholic, and we were told that there would be a video link, but sadly they can't be in the church now. We're allowed up to 6 people, no service, no anything really. We've been told to just go straight to the graveside, and we'll get a very short time with her 4 kids. A priest was happily...
You can video it. You can video it, can you, for your page? I know it's not the sort of thing one normally videos. Please, I'm not being trite, but would it help your grand...
No. Possibly, yeah. It's do you know what? It's something I've not really thought about. But obviously my mother's got
staff have personal protection equipment. EasyJet is grounding its entire fleet of aircraft due to the global pandemic and says it doesn't know when it will resume commercial flights. LBC weather, cloudy for most areas with the odd shower, a high of 11 degrees.
LBC Travel, I'm Joanne Webb. Very busy on the M4 westbound, junction 16, and that's because of an accident where only one lane is open. Slightly busy news in Dartford. That car which overturned now being recovered on the Burnham Road, so all the lanes are open. Still quite busy in both directions. On the trains, Gatwick Express services remain suspended until further notice. Other train companies are running, but to a limited service. Also a limited service on the Underground, apart from the Waterloo and City and Circle lines, which remain suspended. There are only trains every 10 to 15 minutes, but a reminder that public transport should only be used for essential journeys.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, James O'Brien.
Life in Britain will not return to normal for 6 months, and when it does, it's unlikely to be a normal that bears much resemblance to the one we've left behind. What's going on in your world?
James O'Brien on LBC.
If If you've lost money on a stocks and shares ISA sold by a bank or financial advisor, you may be due thousands in compensation. Text GOOD to 78900 and Goodwin Barrett will explain your options.
This is a message from the government about the emergency measures to support the economy during the
So I'm a midwife working at a very busy London hospital, and I think as a frontline member of the NHS, we've been totally forgotten in this whole pandemic.
Right.
They keep talking about people on the front lines, they talk about doctors and nurses, GPs and social care workers, but where are they talking about midwives? We are frontline workers. We are still going into the hospital every single day after a suspected or confirmed case of COVID. Now, what about the rest of the nation? They're told to stay at home. They're told to stay 2 meters apart and socially isolate themselves from everybody, because we know this virus doesn't take any prisoners. You know, everybody is susceptible to getting this virus. So what about us? We're working in the hospital. We're around all our colleagues. We're not wearing any protection. We're not wearing any protection with the women we're caring for or the families we're looking after.
What happens if you ask your line manager, whatever it's called, for the relevant kit? Do they say, we'll get it for you, or we haven't got it, or what?
No, we're told it's not the guidelines. We're working in line with the WHO national guidelines. And that's
the World Health Organization.
They also told us that even if we do care for somebody and we need a respirator, there aren't enough to go round because they're all on a boat coming over from China.
And what are your colleagues saying about this set of circumstances?
Well, I was petrified to go back in for my last shift because I'd been at home for annual leave. And those that have been in there recently and going in for regular shifts, they were all just going about their normal day and they weren't that bothered. But of course there are lots of us that are petrified because we still have to come home.
And of course we've now lost the first hospital doctor on the front line due to coronavirus. Louise, thank you. Do look after yourself. Apologies to Sue, to Daryl, to Sandra and others. I'm done for another day. If you want to hear the interview with the Care Minister, Helen Wakely, where I think it's fair to say she didn't perhaps not have a lot of answers to some of the questions, I'll report, you decide. It is on lbc.co.uk. That's lbc.co.uk. I'm done for another day. James O'Brien's coming up the other side of the news here on LBC. I'm doing it again tomorrow morning from 6:30. Meantime, stay safe.
How many times have we joked over the years about the difficulties of finding new ways to approach the same old subjects? Well, I don't think I'll be joking about that again when, God willing, we all come out the other end of this sorry situation. Some of the things that intrigue me today include the plight of self-employed people who pay themselves in dividends. I've heard from a lot of you over the weekend, and some of you are facing, well, really serious situations. I'm drawn to people who are still stuck overseas, and particularly to the 20,000 volunteers who've taken up the invitation to rejoin the NHS, having retired previously.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, I'm Simon Conway. 20,000 former NHS staff have now said they will return to the service to help in the fight against coronavirus. It follows a government appeal for ex-nurses, doctors and others to come forward. But there are continued concerns about a shortage of personal protection equipment for frontline healthcare workers. The Care Minister, Helen Wakely, has told us it's an absolute priority to ensure the gear is rolled out.
We have to make sure that all healthcare workers and social care workers have the equipment they need to be able to safely carry out care. Over the last 2 weeks, there's been a tremendous effort to get equipment out. Over 170 million pieces of PPE have gone out to hospitals, to hospices, to care providers.
EasyJet has grounded its entire fleet of aircraft due to the COVID-19 pandemic. More details from our correspondent Rachel Venables.
Most of EasyJet's commercial flights have already been cancelled, and in recent days they've been working to repatriate more than 45,000 customers on more than 650 rescue flights, the last of which landed yesterday. The budget airline now says in a statement that thanks to national lockdowns and unprecedented travel restrictions, they have fully grounded their aircraft, and they don't know when commercial flights will start back up again.
More than 250 retired police officers have agreed to come back to the Met Police in London during the coronavirus outbreak. Commissioner Cressida Dick has told us she's hoping even more will come forward.
These are very skilled people. They join the job to help people. They retired with a wealth of knowledge, and we will try to put them back in the areas where they will be able to contribute most. And we're finding out all about them at the moment.
A hospital worker has suffered a fractured cheekbone after he was punched in the face. Greater Manchester Police say the member of staff required treatment following the attack at Salford Royal Infirmary yesterday. A 27-year-old man has been charged. Almost a week into the national lockdown over the coronavirus, more stories
Or competing. When it comes to business, do you know the difference? Say you run into industry mates at an event. You get to chatting, what's been going on, all pretty standard. Talk turns to business. Looks like some of you are going for the same customers. Maybe you can divide and conquer so everyone gets their piece of the pie. Still just business, right? Wrong. When rival businesses agree to carve up markets, it's called market sharing. It's cheating and illegal. And you could be facing big fines or even prison when you get caught. Search cheating or competing to check your business practices before we check them for you. Brought to you by the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
A very good morning to you. It's 3 minutes after 10, and here we are. It's the end of week 1 of confinement for many people. Many people like me didn't follow the order as soon as it was issued, but as soon as it evolved onto don't go to work if you can work from home, here